The snows had learned to keep their own counsel. They fell without hurry, feather upon feather, and lay in the godswood until the weight of them turned branches into bent old men. Under the pale canopy, the heart tree woke sighing. A crimson tear had frozen at the corner of its carved eye, yet still the face seemed less a carving than a witness who would not speak for fear of what his words might change. Jon Snow stood with his glove off, his palm pressed flat against the gnarled skin. The bark was cold, but it was not dead. Beneath the cold, something moved. Not heat, not sap, but a memory of both, like a heartbeat in a drowned body that had stubbornly refused the river's command. Ghost paced behind him, driving his paws into the drift and lifting them again, slow and deliberate, as if the snow were a veil he must not tear. His breath was mist, his eyes a red so clean it might have been the last color left in the world. When he stopped, the old wolf raised his head and stared up into the face as if he, too, expected it to answer. "Keep watch," Jon said. It was less command than habit. Ghost's ear flicked. He was already keeping watch. The godswood belonged to winters older than the looming tower and the rebuilt walls. The pools reflected nothing when the sky was this white. It was as if Winterfell had been a thought the snow was having, and would forget at any moment. Jon had learned to be careful with such thoughts. There had been too many moments when forgetting seemed easier. Of all the duties thrust upon him, remembering might be the cruelest. Branches clacked softly, twig upon twig. The sound moved like a hand through hair. The ravens came with it, black beads strung across the gray. They spilled into the godswood and settled like punctuation. The last to arrive was a bird larger than the rest, its plumage with that oil-on-water sheen that made black look like every color stirred together. It landed above the heart tree and watched. "You're late," Jon said, without turning. The bird made no answer. It was another voice that filled the godswood, a boy's voice, light but steady, as if speaking were no more than breathing out. "No later than the roots." Jon lowered his hand. Bran. A wheel had not brought the boy into the godswood. They had long since learned the paths that would bear him with least pain, and they had cleared them with care, but today he had come by other means. The ravens lifted again, once, twice, then settled. Beneath their shifting, the boy himself stood in the snow where moments before there had been only air. He was, or seemed, a boy of impossible clarity. Dark hair, a calm pale face, and eyes the green of river water when it carries the woods in it. He wore fur, and his breath smoked, and yet something about him was untouched by the cold. Jon had seen him come this way before, seen and never entirely learned the shape of what he was seeing. "Your face is a white lake," Bran said. "You've been awake too long. Better than sleeping too long." Jon took a breath and let it go. He stared up at the face in the bark. "You said the roots would answer. They haven't." "They have." Bran stepped forward through the drift, the movement too clean for the depth of the snow. It parted for him, or he walked inside the space it would make. He pressed his palm to the trunk beside the carved mouth. "They're slow. In the north we value plain speech. Then listen plainly." Bran's fingers spread until they looked like the rootlets of some plant that had chosen to be a hand. "The road below is broken. It was cut long ago and burned in places where burnings were beloved. The winter was not born, only let loose into the corners and made cunning by hunger. It will keep returning until there is something in the land that remembers the shape of a softer breath. We have to teach it." "We," Jon said. "If it's only me, I can bind and sing and pull," Bran said. "But I am a thread. A thread holds all only in stories. What is needed is a cord made of many things." He took his hand from the tree and turned. "You are one of the things the North knows how to make." Jon almost laughed. Failing that, he smiled. "A thing to tie winter? A thing that winter has touched, and that did not break." Bran's lips moved into their own shadow of a smile. "A thing that remembers warmth when it has no right to." Ghost wheezed softly, shaking snow from his muzzle. He had never been patient with the odd way that Bran's words curled. Jon reached down to scratch the thick fur behind the wolf's ear, and the rumble in Ghost's chest eased. "So," John looked back into the mouth of the face, down the trickle of frozen sap. Tell me what the road is. Tell me what we're walking toward. Not toward. Bran's gaze lifted, and 100 black beads followed it. Under. The old idea had lived in tales and in flinches, like the thought of a cellar no one went down into because the step carved by a great-grandfather's knife had a crack in it now. Beneath the snow and the mud, beneath the frost-bitten loam, beneath the worm and the stone, there had been a net too old for men to love. Roots run into roots, and the taste of iron moved from place to place as if the earth itself had a tongue. It had been called a road not because feet traveled along it, but because the travel of thought was eased upon it. A man with his ear pressed to the ground could not hear the thoughts passing. Likely enough that had been a mercy, but the ground knew. Where a Weirwoods reach met another's, where faces listened but did not speak out loud, there had been bridges of memory and water, widened by the care of hands that were not hands. The singers had coaxed them, lassoed, woven, the way old women can make a rope from horsehair so fine you don't believe it holds until it does. The undulls had cut, the iron men had burned. The South had forgotten, and the North had retreated into remembering, which was the same as hiding if you d it long enough. Then wars and wars, and winter's narrow cleverness. The road had not died. It had merely lost its way. Under, John said, and felt the word climb into his mouth like a cat into the lap of someone it had always known would be there. How many places? As few as 6, Bran said. As many as will answer. Will they answer to you? To us, Bran said. To the north. To hungers forgotten and heats unspent. I have asked the ones that remember when the old tongue was the only tongue and when it wasn't. They'll come if we offer the right coin. John's mouth tightened. What coin? Memory. Bran's eyes met his. Not death. We've had enough of that. Not king's blood. The trees do not set thrones. His voice thinned. For a long time, men paid the road by cutting it and smearing the cut with blood as if they were mending a wound with more wound. It works for a while. Then everything turns to wound. We can pay another way, John. We can pay by giving the road what winter has been stealing. A way to keep stories from freezing. John looked down. Snow had gathered in the lines the years had put on his gloves. I have stories, he said, the words careful. Too many. Some I'd see buried. Buried is not the same as fed to the earth. Bran's mouth moved like a boy trying on the smiles of men he had admired and lived to see disappointed. We'll need the Crannogmen, who have always had more patience for mud than winter. We'll need a man who can argue with a stone until it lies down and becomes a wall again. We'll need the sea to forget its anger for a day. We'll need the North to want this more than it wants to be proud. John's breath slid into the cold like smoke finding its old chimney. And we have? A half-made mended castle, Bran said. A heart tree that looks like it's been crying for 1,000 years. A man who's died and learned rude manners from it. A wolf with more sense than either of you, and the boy you're looking at. He tilted his head, a raven's tilt. Also some friends who remember being men. Friends. John thought of a red woman with eyes like coals leaving no ash, of giants who sang low and were gone, of wildlings who had crossed to find a warmer death and had found instead the longer hunger that wore a holdfast's face, of Tormund, whose laugh could kick snow out of the trees, but who had laughed less of late. Friends. That was a word winter was always salt toward. Where do we begin? Where it allows, Bran said. At Winterfell, with the springs. We thread warmth first where it remembers coming, and teach it paths to walk. Then the barrows, then the black gate, then the sea. You make it sound like a feast, John said. It is, Bran said, and the ravens rustled. A feast for roads. They started with the pools, where steam rose with the delicacy of a hand bringing a cup to the mouth of a sleeping child. Winterfell had lived on those breaths, and the breaths had been fed by tunnels that men of the past had built without knowing all the old reasons. Only that stone that held warmth would keep their children's bones from splintering. Bran knelt where the moss kept its green under a thin coat of snow and put his hands on the ground while John went with men to the stones. Lord Glover came with his beard neatly combed and his scars unneatened. Lady Meej's kin brought women with arms like axe handles and faces that made the young smiths work harder under their glances. The Manderley boy who had spent his first winter as a man learning how to dig latrines in ground that would not dig came in shame and stayed in usefulness. The small folk came with spades and with their children to chase a little luck into their sleeves. The cook sent soup and then more soup and bread that steamed when broken. John carried stones as if he were any other man, because he knew how to carry stones. He watched as Bran traced lines between the pools and the heart tree with fir boughs and strings of river reeds, and he watched the ravens hopping behind like black priests who had made their peace with irreverence. A little girl from the kitchen stood staring at Bran, then cautiously reached out to touch one of the reed strands. Bran did not scare her off. He smiled as she laid the reed in another shape and looked up for approval with the simple hunger of those who seldom find it. After, her mother would claim a little of that story to tell by the pot, and the warmth in the kitchen would seem more honest to her than any brought by a lord's order. It took 3 days to lay the first thread. They worked when the light came, and when it left they worked by torch and by the strange constant dusk that the snows gave as they reconsidered their fall. The men who had shouted at each other over debts and wrong-sided fences found themselves agreeing over how best to shape the path of the stones down toward the roots. When they argued, their anger steamed and dissipated in air that had better things to do than carry it around forever. Bran slept an hour at a time, sometimes not at all. He ate little, and when he drank it was as if he were giving the water something, not asking it. On the 4th day, in the hour before dawn that is made entirely of the memory of former dawns, John put his hand back on the heart tree. He closed his eyes without thinking. The bark was still cold. The cold had an edge on it, like new whetted iron. He remembered a fire under stone. The color did not burn his eyes because it had no need to. It lay and pulsed like a resting beast, and above it the roots were strands of something that wanted to be taught. There was a tang of iron and a sweetness that was not sap. A voice, maybe, or the feeling of a voice about to be there. He opened his eyes. The face in the bark looked exactly as it had. "Did you hear it?" Bran asked, without looking up from the reed strands that now made a map of something John could not have named even if he had been given a King's-Ar. "Ansem of good words." "No," John said, "but I smelled it." Bran glanced up and smiled, and it was the smile of the brother who had once wanted to be a knight. Nothing strange about it. "Good," he said. "Then it's begun." They stayed half a fortnight in the Godswood, teaching the warmth paths to the roots. The old gods took their due in skins scraped on stone and nails broken hauling, in the small sacrifices that bind people to a task. When they went to the barrows, they went light. John left orders with Lord Glover and the rest and chose his companions with care. He chose a Crannogman before any lord. The man was scarcely taller than Bran when Bran had been 10. He moved like water that has learned patience on its own because no one ever taught it. His name was Cotter Reed. He owned no armor, though he wore a shirt of bronze scales that had belonged to an ancestor who had charmed a smith and a fish on the same day. He had a smile like a blade that had been filed until it remembered kindness. "Your father," John said, when Reed had lifted his shaggy head in the great hall and said, "You sent for a reed." "Reeds are a kind you send for," Cotter said. "One comes. Does it matter which?" His eyes had mischief in them, but none for the work. "It matters, but I'll ask you only what I asked him." John had never expected to stand above men he respected and say words they had not asked to hear. It was easier now. It was worse, too. "I need patience with mud. I need a man who will not shout when his feet are cold." "My feet were born cold," Reed said and grinned. Torment came because he would not be left out. He brought with him 6 men who smelled like smoke and old furs and a woman with a scar drawn neat from lip to ear who had once carried her child across a wind that had blown men sideways. The watch sent 10 good men and 1 bad one whose badness was the breed that could be yoked to a task and talk to it all the while. John left him with Glover. No good would come of letting him whisper to the road. There were surprises. A Manderley boatman named Tully, as if names were a game and the gods were children, begged leave to come as far as the White Knife. "I know the river when it sulks," he said. You can use that knowing. A sulking thing'll go as you wish, if you let it think it was its own thought. John had a taste for words that did not think they were poetry, and he liked the man's hat, which was uglier than a flayed pig's dream. Bran would ride when he wished and walk when he wished, and sometimes the woods seemed to fold and let him move along inside the kind of stories old women forget they told. People were learning to stare at him less. It suited John's temper. On the third day, a child found them. She stepped out of the brush like a deer that had decided to be a girl. Her hair was the color of the winter grass that sometimes finds it in itself to attempt spring under the leeward side of a stone. She wore a cloak the green of rotting leaves and the brown of the earth that rots them and the white of old bone. Her eyes were gold, and a vertical pupil went narrow in the sun when the clouds shifted. "You," Tormund said, the word coming out lower than he had meant it. He shifted his spear as if it had become too heavy for one hand. The men behind him muttered, the kind of sound that means a body remembers an old story it had no right to think it would meet. The child cocked her head like a bird. "We," she said, and laughed softly. How women and men love that word when they suddenly think there are many of them. She looked at Bran. "You called." "I asked," Bran said. "Close enough." She hopped light onto a fallen log, and her toes made no sound. "I am ash leaf in your tongue, which does not sing properly. When the snow fell tallest, I was called water that remembers spear." Her smile made Tormund lower his spear without knowing he had. "You can call me what you wish, if you do it with breath that does not lie." Jon stepped forward. "Jon Snow." "Snow." She rolled the word like a nut between tongue and teeth. "The men of Iron would have called you Knifeborn if they had been kinder to their own stories. A name is always a wound and a salve together. Keep yours." She dropped lithe to the ground and held out a hand to Bran. He put his in it. Their fingers looked very human together, which somehow was worse than if they had not. "We have a little of what you need, not all. The rest you must take from things that do not want to give or do not know they are able to." "Where?" Bran said. "The Barrows first," Ashleaf said. "There is an old bridge there. It went cold when the Menwater cut the face off a tree and made a roof of it for their gods. You will put it back. Then the gate that speaks." "The Black Gate," Jon said. "Your tongue cannot help itself," she said, not unkindly. "All things must be made into an enemy or a lover or a door." Her eyes went to Ghost, who had been silent, his muzzle powdery with snow. "And you will be a bridge that growls." Ghost sneezed, which in a man would have been laughter. They made the barrows by dusk, and the barrows made them wait. Wind moved in the grass as if the dead were dragging the hems of their long coats along it. Jon had been there before, half a world ago, inside himself. He had gone as a boy walking in a legend and had walked out a man barely holding in his hand his own blood. Now he came as a man and felt a boy stir in his chest the way a dreaming child stirs when a parent opens a door quietly and thinks the quiet is a lullaby. They built no fires. Ashleaf hissed when Tormund reached for a spark, and the big man shrugged and tucked his tinder back. "We'll sleep cold," he said. "Better cold than stung." The wildlings settled, deft as cats making nests, and Reed vanished into the dark and reappeared with his boots muddy and his hands full of the little frogs that make good soup if you pretend you don't know what you're swallowing. He men of the watch stood watch and spoke the watchwords under their breath and found them less comforting out here among old kings than they had been on stone. Bran walked until he found the barrow whose slope had the right lean, and Jon followed and found him kneeling. "There was a tree," Bran said. "There was a bridge of thinking and feeling and learning. Men cut it. They carried its face into their hall and said, 'Look what we took.'" "Revenge," Tormund growled from behind them, because he had a sense for what made history sit up. "No," Bran said quietly. "We can't set the old balance by cutting again. We make new." He put his palms down, then his forearms, then his cheek until it looked as if he were listening to a giant's heartbeat that he hoped to guess. Ashleaf put one hand on his hair. The ravens moved around them until their circle was a necklace. Jon set his hand to the ground in mimicry without shame. Ghost lay with his chest flat and his great head turned to press one ear to the earth. A sound rose that was not sound. A scent came that was not scent, though John could taste it. Iron and the faint honey of rot, that means the rot will become dirt that will hold green. The dead did not object. They had lost that privilege long ago. What they did was settle, a little like beds that have been slept in all winter and have learned the shape of the body that sleeps in them and sigh when the body shifts. Ashleaf cut her palm without flinching, but it was not blood that fell. Her sap was pale and threads of it coiled like spiders drinking frost. She touched the ground with it. "Old bridge," she said in a language John's ear did not hear until the meaning had already entered his bones. "We have brought you stories. We have brought you the breath of wolves and the stubbornness of men and the way a reed bends. Eat." Bran's voice answered, English only in that John understood it, not because it could have been spoken in a keep. "Old bridge. What we give is not a cut. What we give is a way to remember warmth longer." John closed his eyes and, because he had to, let go of a little one. A story no one else would miss. A smell, the way the stables had smelled one rain-slick night when he had been 13 and old Nan had told a tale that kept him from sleep for 2 nights after, and he had loved being kept, because the fear made him feel like a boy with a mother who would come tuck him in. He let it slide. It took something to do it. The pride of ownership that was ridiculous in the face of the Barrows, and yet fierce as any lord's. He opened his eyes to the stars burning so steadily they almost seemed an answer. Bran breathed, and Reed breathed, and something under the barrow like a great cat eased out one claw. The grass trembled. Tormund's hand tightened on his spear, and then loosened when he saw that the trembling was not earth threatening men but earth remembering to be a cradle. The ravens bobbed, and their beads became beads of water on the grass as a quiet not quite fog crept, not from the sky but the ground. They slept that night in folds, the living and the memory of the dead. And when they woke, frost had written around the barrow in a script that had not been written by frozen rain. The lines had the flow of handwriting and the order of a road. Ashleaf nodded and licked her finger and erased one curl and drew another with nothing but her warmth. "Good," she said. "It will hold until you teach the gate that speaks the new answer it must have." Took them 7 days to reach the night fort. Old stones like teeth in a mouth too long without bread. Men did not sleep there well, but they had slept among barrows, and so the night fort seemed almost honest. The well where a boy had once become a story, and the story had become what the well was called in men's mouths, breathed up cold that had no water in it. Bran stood at its rim and watched it as if it might throw up a trout. Ashleaf crouched and stared until her head cocked and stayed, cocked like a child listening for a mouse. "It is a throat," she said. "We need to teach it words." At the black gate beneath the night fort, John's skin remembered fear so perfectly it did not need his mind's help. The face in the weirwood there had always seemed more person than shape to him. When it opened its mouth and the voice that lived in stone and water and oath spoke, men's knees weakened and the bravest became grateful to any god who could be called upon to be deaf. You had to say the words. The words made you know, if you had not known already, whether you were what you thought you were. They went down. The light went down with them. Ashleaf moved as if she had all the light on a string and was borrowing it politely. The face waited, half in stone, half in something much less forgivable. Its lips were the bark of a tree that had grown not in a forest but around a truth. The voice when it came was the voice of a door that remembers the hand that made it and is disappointed by most of the hands that ask to be let in. "Who comes?" it asked. "Bran," Bran said. "A part of the north you learned long ago." "John," John said, because lying would be noticed here, even if nowhere else. The face's eyes shifted only because faces have to. The voice moved, slow, as if a parlor trick were being performed by the man who had invented the trick and could not be bothered to pretend he was surprised by it. "You know the words." "I do," John said. He spoke them. He was always surprised by how it hurt and healed all at once to do it. When the face opened, it opened like a wound. They went through. Ashleaf stood still as the lid of a chest while the men of the watch muttered. "Doors love words," she said. "It is because they are always being asked and are seldom answered." In the black place the roots thrummed. John held his breath without naming why. He felt Bran move to a place that had no place in it and kneel. He felt like the briefest fiada. Our touch upon the back of his neck, all the times and the things this tree had listened to and not said. He knew the thing the road wanted here. Not blood, not cut, not hurt. It wanted to be asked. Bran asked. His voice went low and simple. Can you hold a little heat? Can you pass it on? Not all at once. Little, the way the kitchen keeps a glow under ash, so you don't have to strike flint in the dark. Silence filled up around them the way cold fills a bucket if you leave it outside overnight. The gate was old. Old did not mean cruel. Old meant, I have had time to be cautious. Old meant, I have had time to be made to speak for men who did not deserve it. No more cuts, Bran said to it. No more walls that cannot be mended because all the stone is insult. He touched the root closest to the face. Old one, you guard. Guard this as well. The face did not change. The feeling did. Jon had no word for it except a word that men do not like to give doorways. Trust. It was not trust earned. It was trust like a child gives on a day when it has not yet learned that beds can be cold after all. The gate breathed. Jon had never thought a thing of wood and stone could do such a human action. It breathed and seemed only for a heartbeat to relax. The ravens above ground exploded into air. Their sudden beating came down to them somehow, a far-off noise in a deeper room. Bran took his hand away. It will pass along what it can, he said. We should go to the sea. Now? Reed asked, his voice going tight at the thought of salt and big water. When the river asks for the sea, Ashleaf said lightly. And the sea pretends it did not hear. They went east across snow that lay like a well-behaved dog, and then west when the dog got tired and wanted to misbehave. The world had begun to feel like a map in a hall that someone had adjusted long ago and then never taken the ink to again. They put their feet down in places where the road wanted them, because there was a new thing tugging now, a tug like the hand of a child who knows where the sweetbread is kept. Fires burned on cliff tops, waves broke, seals cried in their clean voices, and a wind that smelled like knives learned to smell a little like rope. At White Harbor, the Manderley boy's sister came out to meet them in a cloak like a ship's sail. Our ovens are honest, she said. Our boats are tired. The sea has been a mouth with bad teeth. She walked straight to Bran and nodded respectfully as a woman nods to a priest she considers useful but not vital, then turned to Jon and met his eyes the way men meet a man who looks like what they thought a man should look like. She said, We'll do as you ask if you give us salmon nets. We're not fools. You give. We give. Her smile was quick and bright and had a baker's pride in it. Salmon nets, Jon agreed, thinking later that he had agreed to more and less than she had asked. It did not matter. The agreement had been recognition. When you set words between people like bricks, you have to be careful afterward not to walk away and leave them to fall on someone. They went on. The sea lay like a god pretending it was a man trying to pretend it was a god. On Skagos, the cliffs snapped at the sky. People met them with eyes that had learned to be private, and with animals that had learned to make do with the land that had made them hard. A girl named Carrie from among the Stoneborn led them along a path that was a rumor the cliff had told itself. She rode a little one-horn with tangled mane and an expression like an old sailor. Don't pat him, she warned Tormund when she saw that man's hand go out with the idiot good nature that had charmed bears and offended lords. He'll bite your fingers and think they were a story invented to amuse him. At a place where the sea had gnawed a great bite from the island and the bones of the land were all chalk and the chalk was written upon with roots, a weirwood clung. It had grown on the cliff itself, its roots spilled like hair into the wind, its face half broken by an old fall. Red sap had dried in lines that made the scars of a god who had once been a boy. The cliff breathed up salt, and the salt had salted the bark until it looked like bread left too long in a winter kitchen. This one remembers only storms, Bran said, his own voice oddly fragile in the strange white light. The wind took it and broke it and gave it back again. What does a storm remember? Tormund asked because he could not help himself. Where it has been, Ashleaf said, never where it is going. She lifted her hand and showed Bran, not with words but with the motion of her fingers, the old signs the singers had made when the sea was young enough to be flirted with. Bran watched. Then he did them. His fingers were clumsy. The wind made of it a grace. He laid his palm to the bark. John had to dig his boots into chalk to stand beside him. His hand found a root that wanted a hand. "Old one," Bran said without ceremony, "we need what you have taken. Give us some, not all." His breath came clouded and blue against sap and salt, as if he were persuading a stubborn horse. The Weirwood's face did not unbreak. Faces are slow. Something loosened below. There was a trick to it. John felt it inside the bones of his hand, where a child once holds his father's finger and will not let go in the crowd. You loosen not by yanking, but by making a better grip just past the first. Heat moved. Not much. The smallest whisper. John was not ashamed of how his breath caught. "Salt and smoke," Tormund said, almost reverently. "A man could live where there's both." They took what the cliff could give. The sea nipped and worried as if it disapproved of charity. Carrie's one horn snorted and stamped and, finally, curled its lip at the wind as if to tell it to go find someone else to bully. The Skagosi gave them dried meat and a sack of onions and a promise. "We will not sink your boats," Carrie's grandmother said, which in SK. A ghost was as good as a letter of invitation to a wedding. They returned as men come home from a fair and pretend they have not bought something they'll be ashamed of in the morning. Lighter, uneasy. Back at Winterfell, the air felt different, and not only because the kitchens had begun to tell the flour a new story and the ovens opened their mouths more easily. The Godswood's quiet had a texture to it that John had not noticed before. The quiet of a house where someone is finally sleeping in the bed that had been kept made for them. He set his hand to the heart tree and smelled again the iron-sweet memory of warmth under stone. He dreamed that night. No, he lay with his eyes closed and learned something he had not asked to learn. Of a place far beyond their feet where a ring of old stones stood like men deciding whether to speak. Between them was snow gone blue with evening. Upon the blue, a trickle of breath was moving. So thin any man would have said there was nothing to see. The trickle widened. It learned how to flow. It found a groove under ice. It lit the air above it with the faintest halo of not cold. He woke before dawn to the hall's timbers cracking gently the way timbers do when warmth nudges them after a long night. He lay listening to the little sounds a house makes when it remembers it is a house and not a tomb. He found he had let go of another small story in the night. He could not recall the exact words of a song a girl had once sung under an old sky. He could recall the feel of the night, how his horse had been restless under him, how the notes had seemed to climb the air like a hand going up the rungs of a ladder. He felt the loss, and under it a relief that felt like blasphemy, then a steadiness that was not his. He put his hand to Ghost's fur and turned his face back to the dark until it was day. It was not a victory that could be put on a shield and shown at a market. It could not be declared from a rampart by a crier with lungs like goatskin. The men kept doing things. They took their warmed fingers and put them to tasks they had been putting off for months. They mended tools they had meant to throw away. They went to barns they had promised not to use again because the roofs had sagged too much, and they straightened the roofs by talking to them with ropes and posts and 4 men pushing as one. They got through the 5th day of a week and did not wonder if the week had been longer than it should be. They also went hungry less. It is a small thing, the difference between eating and eating enough. It is the difference between a man who will sell his neighbor for bread and a man who will share half of it because he trusts there will be another half tomorrow. The road was not mended by deeds. Deeds are what men put on songs to make them lie better. It was mended by threads. They went to Long Lake and taught it how to keep its edges soft when it should have been a knife. They went to Queen's Crown, where the Causeway had once taught John about not dying and set reeds in new lines. And the Causeway learned how to be generous without losing its mind. They found an old weirwood at Deepwood, a tree that had been spared because a woman had sat down under it once with her man, and they had made a promise there, and the promise had kept the axes from biting. They asked that tree to remember for another tree that had not been spared. They paid with a memory of an axe dropping without biting, the tension that had been in the arms holding it, the way the breath had been held and then let go. Stories, Reed said one night by a fire that a singer had coaxed from wood that should not have burned. Who knew the world would want them? The world always wanted them, Ashleaf said. staring into the flames with pupils gone thin. "You just forgot that it would pay for them." "What pays you?" Tormund asked bluntly. He had the look of a man trying to forgive the world for being stranger than he preferred. "Time," Ashleaf said, and her voice had no pity in it because she was telling him something good. "And not never dying. That is a payment with a bad end." Bran smiled in a way that made Jon look at him twice. The boy had gone thin, yes, but he was not frail. His thinness had an intention to it, like the strong line of an archer's bow. His eyes were older than his face and younger than his voice. He would look at a thing, stone or snow or man, and Jon felt that the thing was seeing itself more rightly because of it. They did not talk like this always. Men cannot stay in the high rooms without making themselves dizzy. They laughed at small things and disagreed about soup and who was least likely to ruin a snare and whether the wind favored the east road. It matters the way people continue in their human. Keeps magic from trying to embarrass them. Of course there were those who thought it folly. A sent letter from a lord who liked killing as long as he could call it justice arrived at Winterfell with hard words arranged neatly upon it like crows on a wall. When they had finished he said, "It is cruel to ask a Chi LD to be good by freezing his fingers." The priests were offended and then ashamed without being willing to admit it. They went away because the road was not theirs, and because a little warmth is a serious argument. In the Bar Rollins, they met the last thing that would have stopped them if it had been given middling luck. Whites had not died out simply because men had learned to be clever. They had gone cold in corners, and when the road woke and began to move its warmth around, what lay in the corners woke as well, angry at being woken and old enough to be encouraged by anger. The first they saw was a hand. It stuck up from the snow like a root the wind could not be bothered to cover. Then the arm. The body fought the earth for its continuation. "Burn," a man from the watch said automatically. It was the right thing, and the road did not care whether they were gallant about it. They burned what needed burning. But there was a place where the whites had nested. A ring of stones so close to the old place in Jon's dream that he wanted to curse at Providence for being theatrical. They rose as men sometimes rise, because the men beside them do. A dozen, two, then more. They came toddling with the pathetic rage of babies with knives in their hands. Then there was no room for pity. Men killed, women killed. Ghost was all red mouth and white in white. Ashleaf's face went flat, older than Story, as she flicked her small knife from body to body and taught the road how to pull heat without being poisoned by it. Jon found himself in the middle of them, where men like him always find themselves without quite understanding how they got there. One white wore a helm whose crest had been a boar long ago. The boar had become a smear of rust and old blood. Jon split the helm and the skull under it with a grim familiarity that made him suspect he had never been a good man, only a useful one. He wanted, stupidly, to apologize to the dead for the way he had gone on living while they went on being used. Bran stood in the ring. He was not armed. The whites did not go at him the way men go at an unarmed man out of contempt or caution. They avoided him badly the way flies avoid a lamp after the first ones are killed by it. He put his hands to a stone so old it had forgotten how to be as sure of itself as it had once been, and spoke. The words were not the Watch's, not the Singers, not the South's. They were simple words of observation. "You are stone," he said. "You were set here to hold a circle. You forgot. Remember." He tapped gently. The stone remembered. Then, like a knight who thinks better of a fight because his wife is watching from the window, it settled. The whites fell. That was not the right verb. They collapsed like things propped whose props had been quietly removed. The one with the boar helm went last, and in its going looked up as if there were someone to apologize to after all. Jon stood panting and hating that his relief was so keen. The road pulsed, a steadying. Ashleaf licked her lips and spat brown, then said without turning, "Do not be afraid of dying things. They have already done the worst of it." Later, when the dead were burned and men's hands had thawed so they could hold cups again, Bran spoke as if remarking on weather. "The last knot is north." "North where?" Reed asked, who knew 100 kinds of north. "The fist," Bran said. He looked at Jon when he said it, and John felt the old fist close around his own heart. There were roads even in the haunted forest for those who knew where the roads did not want to be. They followed them, and then left them when even Ashleaf could not pretend the woods were being generous. The wind had a voice with shapes in it. Men slept two to a cloak and woke with their beards rimmed. Ghost led when men could not see. He would stop and look back with impatience as if to say, "You've had years to learn this and you haven't. It is a wonder you're not all dead." John did not argue with him, aloud. At last the fist rose. Snow had drawn it round and softer than it should be. It looked like a knuckle under a white glove. The old cairns on its crown were lumps upon lumps. The world beyond it had the kind of gray that has almost made its peace with being black. They climbed. When they stood in the ring of stones, the wind's voice turned quiet like a drunk lowered by his friends into a chair before he knocks the cups over. The quiet might have been reverence or recognition or a turning of the head toward the thing that was about to be made. "This is where it cuts," Bran said. "This is where a road goes wild because it thinks it was made to be wild. We tame it," Tormund said, dubious. "No," Ashleaf said. "We remind it that it likes people." Bran crouched. He put his hand to the snow. He closed his eyes. John felt it then, not with the hand he put on the stone, not with the wolf at his side, but with a part of himself he had never admitted to owning because it had nothing to do with sword or oath. He felt the north itself lean toward a possibility. If you had asked him later, he would have said it leaned like a horse does when it smells a stable after a long ride. He let out a breath he had been holding since he had first put on black and said words that tied his life to a wall. "Old road," Bran said, and his voice was older. Not old like dust. Old like the first time a child was told not to put his hand in the fire and believed it. "We pay with stories. We pay with memory. We pay with our own stubbornness. Learn this. When winter comes, carry warmth. Do not hoard it all in one place. Do not give it all away. Make it move like thought moves when a woman is deciding whether to forgive her husband." He smiled, and the smile was awful and beautiful. "We ask as men. We ask as wolves. We ask as trees. We ask as things that will turn to dirt and feed you when you are lonely." The road listened. John knew this as surely as he knew his own name. It had listened many times and learned to be suspicious. It had listened once to men who wanted to be gods and learned to be cruel. It listened now, and something about the lowness of the ask, the lack of swagger, the humility of offering what little they had, stories, habits, the warmth from their busy bodies, found a groove in it that had not been used since before axes thought themselves important. John closed his eyes and paid what he could pay that would not break him. He gave the image of the wall at dawn when he had first seen it after days of travel, and how stupid and impossible it had seemed, and how he had loved it for being both. He gave the sound Ghost had once made when left alone by a man John had trusted who betrayed him nonetheless. He gave the feel of a girl's red hair under his hand and not the name that went with it, because names are cuts and he was done with cutting when it wasn't needed. He let it go. It hurt, steadied him. Ghost put his muzzle to the snow and exhaled. John did not know until that moment that wolves could choose not to steam in winter. He did, and the breath went into the snow and the snow seemed, for a flick, to breathe back. Ashleaf sang. It was the first time she had. She had hummed earlier and mocked and told truths and hissed. Now she sang in a thin high voice that had no child in it whatsoever. The words had no tights in the tongue, no ornaments. She sang like water running under ice. Reed put his hand on the ground without expression. The way men touch their own hair when it is time to cut it. Tormund blinked very fast and said nothing because sometimes even a talking man needs to see what silence will bring him. The road took it. It did not rush. It drew it in the way a woman draws a thread through a needle's eye and then knots it with the competence of a person who has mended the same tear 100 times. It took what they offered and then did what roads do when no one is shouting at them. It found easiest paths. It went under old stones and down the sides of hills on the lee where men had sometimes found dead sheep thawed first. It touched springs and asked them for a little surplus. It teased the sea in 3 places and convinced it to give without taking yet more. Spread slow. It learned the map Bran had drawn on the ground with reeds, and then drew its own that had a better memory for ravines. When it touched the black gate, John felt it. He felt the gate take a breath again. A door that had learned to stop being greedy with its breath. He smiled without meaning to, and no one saw. Then, because nothing given is given without a price, it asked. Bran went still the way boys do when they are about to take a beating and will not run because the running would shame them more than the pain. He lifted his head very slightly, as if it were heavy and had asked for politeness. "Yes," he said softly. "You can have it." "Have what?" John asked, the words dry. "Nothing you need," Bran said. He gave something, then. John did not know what it was until later, when he watched his brother watching children at play in the yard and saw how his face softened not at the running, not at the laughter, not at the risk, but at the way the children were utterly certain that the ground would be under their feet when they let go of the wall. He realized then, Bran had given the memory of falling. He had given away the moment when he had been a boy and not careful enough and the world had turned inside out and left him in it broken. He had been holding it like a king holds a knife under his cushion to remind him that sleep is foolishness. He had let it go. In exchange, the road agreed to carry the softness of the springs under the snow all along its length and to make winter hurt less where it could be taught to do so. When they came down off the fist, the air felt ordinary. It was different the way a house is different the morning after someone has gone through and taken all the cobwebs out of the corners and put candles back in holders that had been empty for a decade. If you were not the kind to notice corners, you would not notice. The kind who notices is the kind who mends things. Enough of the North were menders. They went back through the forest. Men have a talent for making long things short in their minds when they are coming home. The road helped them. It was not cheating. It was kindness, and men take to kindness slowly, as if suspicious. They came to the wall. There were no speeches. The men of the watch who had gone with them looked up at the old blue and did not hate it as much. Winterfell received them with the particular quiet that means its people have learned that shouting is useless and have decided to use laughter as their noise. The kitchens were hotter. The women who kneaded and the men who split wood had found new ways to be sure of each other. The children slept with their hands out of the blankets more often than not. The river did not run free in January like a drunken boy. It ran under crusts as always. It made its own little rooms under ice and said nothing about them. What changed was this. In the coldest weeks, mist lay in the morning along the hedgerows. Under the mist, the rime was less cruel. In the barns, the animal's breath rose and did not fall immediately, as if there were hands under it to catch and hold. At White Harbor, the sea did not eat boats because it was in a mood. It took them only when it meant to, which is harm enough. The lords wrote fewer letters. The priests of R'hllor sent a third man with an apology hidden inside a lecture about discipline and the necessity of hunger for the spiritual life, and were amazed to find themselves welcome at table, and then more amazed to find themselves feeling wretchedly attached to the house's warmth when they left. The Crannogmen returned with new stories that were, for them, scandalous in their fondness for the dry. Not all was well. Houses that had built their pride on end. Uriens alone did not like the friendliness of the cold. Hard men who had hated those who could not be hard discovered that they had lost their surest reason for contempt. A few turned their contempt inside, and drank, and beat what was at hand. It was not magic's fault. Magic only ever makes people more what they are unless someone tells it a better story. John told it as often as he had breath. He sat at tables he did not prefer and listened to farmers talk about the shape ice makes on pond edges now. He watched Bran speak softly to leave alone the ghosts in corners who no longer had a purpose and see them loosen like badly tied knots. Spring came when it meant to. It had the old smell, mud and green together. Men make too much of spring because they like to brag about their endurance in winter and be repaid for it. The spring this time stirred deep. Its edge moved slow undergoing. At Torrens Square, the sap rose in the orchard with a sound that made old women cross themselves against naughty thoughts. In the rills, the little flowers came up not all at once, not like a riot with sticks in hand, but in their turn as if they had been given a schedule and a patient mother. On Skagos, a goat bore 3 kids and all lived, which was a thing the grandmothers kept telling each other when it rained because it gave them something to believe in besides the rain ending. John slept badly and well by turns. When he slept well, He dreamed of houses staying warm and of the sound of a man's step on the stair when he comes home late and tries not to wake the house. When he slept badly, he dreamed he could not recall the color of an eye he had once loved. He would wake angry, then ashamed of his anger, then peaceful. He did not stop being a man because the road had learned to be kinder. He was still the sort of man who thinks in oaths and measures himself against tasks. He merely had more good work to do than harm to undo. There were final things. There are always final things in stories and never in lives, and the problem of lives is that they do not close when the music swells. Bran went often to the God's Wood and more often to the roots that were everywhere now, whenever a man put his hand to a tree and thought of its shape and not his own. The boy's eyes grew a green that sometimes frightened people and then made them ashamed of being frightened. He laughed more, quietly, like a brook that knows the stone that does not bruise it anymore. One evening, after a day that had been nothing but petty goodnesses, Jon went to the heart tree and put his hand to its bark. He stood there long enough that the light changed, and the red sap looked for a moment like a thing that had not been frozen. He thought, as he seldom let himself think, of the man who had given him his name and the woman who had given him the thing names cannot change. He wondered if the road now carried warmth to places where their bones lay. He wondered if bones care. He hoped the road made a little mist there in the mornings, just enough to soften the grass. Bran came without being noticed. It was a trick he had, and it never ceased to be irritating. He stood beside Jon and did not speak for a while, the way a brother stands beside a brother when no one needs stout words to do the work that standing does. "You offered too much," Jon said, his voice low. "At the fist." "Not too much," Bran said. "Exactly enough. You let go of the falling. I kept the landing." It put him more squarely into something he had been leaning into on one foot for years. Women in the Vale heating stones at noon and wrapping them in cloth to put in the beds of their sick old men found that the stones stayed warm long enough to carry through a night that would otherwise have had to be wrestled with. A vassal in the far Barrow. Lands learned how to lay ditches so that frost lifted from the road first where the ditch turned cunningly. The iron men scoffed and then, secretly, took to twisting rope that kept the wet off better and wondered aloud why their fingers were less blue. The children of the forest remained few and sang seldom to anyone's hearing. But sometimes late at night a woman would go to draw water and find a small figure sitting on the well lip watching the sky as if it belonged to her, and the woman would nod as if she did not mind the trespass and the figure would nod back as if she had earned the right to sit there. There were troubles. There are always troubles. A lord who had built his country seat around the fact that people feared winters in his district lost face and tried to make a new winter by sending men to burn weirwoods at the edge of his neighbor's land. The weirwoods without faces are easily enough coaxed to burn. That is why men feel safe hating them. Jon rode. He rode with 10 men and a raven cloud that had taken to a bad habit of showing off above him because they knew how it looked. He spoke to the Lord in a tone no one survived defying more than once. The Lord left his seat and went to live with an aunt whose daughters neither married nor bore him children, and he died old and puzzled. When his body was taken out, they said the air in his house had the most pleasant cool to it. Men left the wall less often by the back stairs at night. They did not cease entirely. It is not a sane world that expects men who have sworn vows during a storm never to have found a sunny day too soft afterward. But when the cold is a teacher and not an executioner, shame has less work to do. The last thing Jon did was also the smallest, so small he did not see it as a deed at all. He walked the grounds with a woman from the kitchens, the one whose little girl had changed Bran's map with a reed. The girl ran ahead and came back, as the children of the north do in a spring that does not betray their knees. The woman said, "Lord, I know I shouldn't, but sometimes I feel as if the gods aren't watching as hard." Jon looked at her and saw the caution in her eyes that comes of too many years of a cold that punishes thought. He said, "Let them rest." And the woman laughed and did not look afraid of the laugh's echo. They buried no kings. They raised no new walls but the little ones around fields that keep cows sensibly in. They had feasts when there was enough to feast with, and when there was not they made the soups that are worth more than feasts because they make a debt men like paying. Jon grew white at the temples rather than white all at once. Ghost's muzzle went gray and his eyes more patient. Bran grew into a man in the way men who have been other things grow into men. Sideways, and then suddenly like a stone has lifted off their chest. When a child asked Jon what he had done, he said, "I walked." When a woman asked Bran whether the old gods loved them more now, he said, "They are more comfortable." Men are easier to love when they are comfortable. Ashleaf went away one day without telling anyone she had gone, because that is how she had arrived, and men found themselves at odd hours looking at a place where she had once stood and feeling that they had forgotten to say thank you. Reed went back to the neck and taught a boy how to listen to the reeds when they spoke without speaking, and told the boy a story about a road that had learned to carry warmth like a frog's back carries a drop of water without tearing it. The North did not become the South. It did not stop making hard men and women. It did not cease being itself. It ceased promising death as the only way to keep faith. It learned to accept a bowl of soup from a neighbor without acting as if it were a knife slipped into a sleeve. It remembered what all places forget if they have been proud long enough without being ashamed. Mercy is not a bargain. It is the way a road is kept passable between houses you want to walk to. When winter came after a great many years, and bit as it had been built to bite, Jon Snow stood once again under the heart tree. He pressed his hand to the bark, and the bark was cold, but what moved beneath it moved with a purpose that had long become familiar. He listened for a while, and then, because he had that right, he spoke to the tree and to the boy now man beside him and to the wolf and to the road that had once asked and been answered. "Hold what you can," he said simply. "Share what you should." Bran nodded. Ghost lifted his head and breathed out. The breath fogged, thinned, and then did not so much vanish as learn where to go. The Snows had kept their counsel. They would keep it still. But when they fell that year, they fell in ways that made roofs brave and hedges beautiful, and did not take from fingers what would be needed come spring. The things men had given away did not punish them. The things they had kept had not festered. The road ran under it all, patient and plain and uninterested in any man's song, which is why it was the best thing men had done in a very long while. The land healed the way wounds heal that are washed in clean water and given time. Children learned to be bored again in winter afternoons, which is the great mercy no one ever thinks to ask of gods. In the slow hours, Jon would sometimes remember the emptiness where a certain lock of hair had once sat in his mind and miss it without regret. In the quicker hours, he would not remember to miss anything except his own horse when it wandered. Bran's eyes kept their green and did not go hard when snow fell, because green does not hate white the way men can, for reasons that shame men once they have been explained. Ghost slept more and was angrier at squirrels, which was his right as a king in winter. And the roads under old learned what men meant by good. Not righteousness, not victory, not glory, good, that steady word like a hand with calluses. They carried warmth the way modest men carry a tune. Plain, sometimes a little off, never showy, always enough for a song to be sung. Winters softened. Men did not. Cows calved and did not freeze where they lay. Wives buried fewer babies. Husbands stayed out longer repairing fences because they were no longer forced inside by a cold that made hands fail. In spring, the dead were remembered not for the drama of their dying but for the wisdom of their living, which is the more difficult memory to keep up. The heart tree did not cry. The red sap still made its old lines, but it did not look like grief to Jon anymore. It looked like a parent keeping track of who had grown and who had not, a guard who had learned to be gentler because he did not have to spend all day fending off marauders. In the pool, the snow's reflection was blue when it should be and gray when it must, and, sometimes, when the clouds went by and the ravens flew striking their small black notes, the pool showed the green of summer in winter's middle, as if the road had decided to see whether it could be generous not only with heat but with beauty. Could. It was. When strangers came north and marveled that the old tales had softened with the snow, and asked what had changed, the people whose mouths winter had once kept tight would shrug and say, "We was tired." Then, if they liked the stranger, they would say, "There was a boy who talked to roots, and a man who had died and was too stubborn to stay that way, and a white wolf and a little woman with eyes like coins." They told the land a better story. And if the stranger was wise, he would understand that stories are not small things here, and that roads are not silent just because they cannot be heard, and that men who place their hands upon a tree and close their eyes are not asking for a miracle so much as permission to become the sort of folk worth having winters worth living through.